Hello everyone, it's Nina and welcome back to my channel. Today we are actually going to be doing my August wrap-up. This is coming out a little bit late, I just haven't had a lot of time to film lately. But I read a lot of really great books in August that I obviously want to talk to you guys about. Starting off in terms of like overall thoughts for this month, I feel like I really slayed this month. I got a lot of books read. I had 3 of them finished within the first week of the month. And I also feel like even though I did have some misses this month, and actually my average rating is lower than it was in both June and July, I feel like overall I was very much in love with like the idea of reading. And reading was a very like fun activity for me. And overall it feels like the good experience as I had while I was reading just like made it all worthwhile. This month my average rating was a 3.6 and I read 3 historical romances, 1 adult fantasy romance, and 4 YA books. So let's go ahead and talk about all the books I read in August. Starting off, we're going to go through the historical romance category. These are all also queer historical romances, since that is my favorite subgenre. And the first 2 books we're going to talk about, if you remember in my July wrap-up, I mentioned I had read A Ruin of a Rake by Cat Sebastian, and I basically decided I was going to go through and read the other 2 main books in that series. I probably also will read the novella that comes after everything in the future as well, but I kind of ended up reading these books in reverse order. So the first book we are going to be talking about is the second book in that series, which is The Lawrence Brown Affair by Cat Sebastian. This book follows our 2 main characters, Lawrence and Georgie. Lawrence is the Earl of Radnor, and he's convinced that he is mad, and he's basically let his family's ancestral home fall to ruin while he stays locked up in a tower working on science experiments. But Lawrence's quiet, lonely life is interrupted when he meets Georgie, who claims that he is coming on to work as Lawrence's new secretary. However, Georgie is not actually a secretary. He is a former con man that has had to flee London when one of his former associates has it out to kill him. And he thinks that by retreating to the countryside, he will be able to kind of like lie low and formulate a plan before he goes back. But he obviously wasn't expecting to fall in love with his new employer. This book was 5 stars. I am obsessed. When I was reading it, I was just like, oh my god, this book is rewriting my brain chemistry. I love Lawrence and Georgie as a couple so much. Lawrence is everything I could have wanted in a main male romantic lead, both in terms of like what makes him attractive, but also being incredibly relatable to me. I think in the dedication, Cat Sebastian mentions that Lawrence is kind of written from the perspective of someone that has a extreme anxiety disorder. But I think there's also a lot of overlap in seeing Lawrence as also being very like autism coded. And him and Georgie really just become the meme of me and the bad bitch I pulled by being autistic. I really just loved all of their relationship building and the way that they bond and care for each other. Lawrence also kind of falls into the single dad trope, which is something I've literally never read from before, but I really enjoyed that element of the story, and I really liked seeing Georgie bond with Lawrence's son Simon. This is kind of a comment both for this book as well as the next book we're going to talk about, but overall I feel that Cat Sebastian's books have a lot of really good hurt comfort in them. Things may seem cute or fluffy or even campy at some parts, but then one or both of the main characters will have this like inner demon that they are dealing with that is kind of healed by their partner. And then during the 3rd act breakup section, they will be pulled back by that demon. And kind of like seeing that duality of how much they have grown and changed by being with the other person is so good. So yes, this book was a 5 stars. I loved it so much. I'm definitely going to get a physical copy of this sometime in the future. And this is definitely another case of you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, because these 2 men are not literally at all what I imagine when I think of Lawrence and Georgie. Okay, the next book we're going to talk about is the first book in the Turner series, and that is The Soldier Scoundrel, also by Cat Sebastian. This book I ended up giving 4 stars. This follows our 2 main characters, Oliver Rivington and Jack Turner, and Jack is also Georgie's older brother. Oliver is a former soldier from the Napoleonic Wars who has a very upright personality and very like strong moral compass, from him seeing like kind of the worst of men during his time in battle. And Jack basically works as like a private eye for wealthy women in need. At the very start of the story, Oliver confronts Jack because he has learned that his sister, Charlotte, has been in some trouble and ended up hiring Jack to get rid of her abusive husband. Oliver then hears Jack take on the case of another woman who is being blackmailed and is determined to find a way to get to the bottom of the case without resulting in any like illegal activities, and ends up poking around on his own, and eventually him and Jack just fully start working together on the case. This book, like I said, I gave 4 stars. It definitely is probably my least favorite of the 3 books in the series I've read, although I still enjoyed it overall. I do feel like this one, in terms of like the overarching plot, it felt like there definitely was more plot in this one compared to the others. It still definitely is a little insta-lusty, but again, I feel like by halfway through the book, I was like, okay, they are cute together, they work really well together, they just kind of need to like get over their internal emotional hurdles for this to work out. I also feel like the levels of sacrificing and groveling that Oliver had to do in the end to prove to Jack that he loves him was also, I would say, the right amount given how rude Oliver was to Jack earlier on in the book. Their overall relationship flavor is definitely like miscommunication through opposite expectations of the other person. And I feel like they both kind of like refuse to speak their mind on this, and it is infuriating, but kind of mostly in a good way, in sort of like building tension for the story. But it also kind of resulted in there being like 3 breakups before the very end where they were like, okay, we love each other and we are going to stay together. And I think that kind of like wishy-washy back and forth element was one of the things I disliked about this book. A positive was I do think it was really fun to read these books in reverse order because Oliver and his sister are side characters in the 3rd book. And honestly, it wasn't until I got to the very end of A Rune of a Rake that I found out that Oliver was the main character of this book. So I don't know, if you really don't care about spoilers for anything, it is kind of fun to read them in reverse order. But yes, overall, I really like the series. I'm definitely going to read more Cat Sebastian books in the future, and also check out the novella that is a FF romance in this series as well. Okay, now let's move on to talking about the other historical romance I read this month, which was Spellbound by Ali Theron. This is a male-male historical fantasy romance that's set in 1920s Prohibition New York City, and it follows our 2 main characters, Rory and Arthur. Rory is a scryer who is a magician that can learn the history of an object just by touching it, and Arthur is just this like regular dude who has a lot of magical friends, and they kind of work together in this like informal organization to contain really dangerous magical artifacts called relics. When Arthur finds out that Rory has his scryer powers, he wants to ask him to do his scrying on one of the relics they have, and Rory is very, very reluctant to work with him. But when Rory ends up getting a vision of a murder that's connected to another relic, he ends up joining up with Arthur and his friends to defend the city from magicians that would use the relics for power and control. This book I really enjoyed as well. It definitely was a little bit of a slow start with just the amount of kind of like enemies to lovers energy that's going on between Arthur and Rory. But by the end, I was like screaming, crying, throwing up. They are so in love and also so stupid. Rory is very much like he's tried to cut out the part of himself that craves and needs help and comfort and friendship. And that kind of leads to him snapping at Arthur a lot of the time and also saying like the opposite of what he means. And then Arthur is like insanely overprotective after having lived not only through World War I, but also seeing some of the evil that other magicians can do for the sake of getting power. So Rory pushing him away is very much him thinking, oh, he hates me, but by God, am I not going to make sure that he's safe? Which results in them being just like such dumb babies. Besides the relationship, I do feel like the overarching plot was very interesting. There definitely was a good amount of world building with just enough detail to keep it engaging without it being like overly complicated. And I thought that the ending was really, really good. Very excited to have read this book. It was one of the books I had on my 24 books to read in 2024. And I'm hoping I can definitely continue the rest of the series this year, if not carry it on into 2025. Okay, now let's talk about the one adult fantasy romance that I read, which was Trial of the Sun Queen by Nisha J. Tooley. This follows our main character, Lore, who is this young woman that basically spent half of her life living in this very brutal prison that's part of the Fae Aurora King's land. After getting into a fight with a fellow inmate, she ends up getting put into this solitary confinement in the woods where it's kind of expected that she will succumb to the elements and die. But instead, Lore is taken to the Sun King's court and is made to compete in these trials to become bonded to the Sun King as his queen. Lore is supposedly there in a kind of like ceremonial position where they have one human tribute amongst 9 other Fae women. But there was definitely some shady stuff going on in terms of like why Lore specifically was the person chosen to fill this place. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. I had heard this book was very much pitched as like one of those like death game competition type books mixed with like The Bachelor. And I was very into that concept as I really love a really good cheesy fantasy romance. And this, I feel like, only really half gave me what I wanted. I feel like I was just kind of bored for a lot of it. And I also feel like the writing style is a little funky. I can't really put my finger on it specifically. Just like some of the language that was used was a little like off-putting to me. I don't know. I think sometimes I do want a more like kind of like brain off, goofy ass fantasy romance to read. And I have been somehow intrigued enough to pick up the second one of this series. And I am liking that one quite a bit more. Just kind of like of the character dynamic and the romantic lead that Lore has in that book. So since I'm like halfway through the next book in the series, I might continue on further along in this series, but this first book just on its own was not really doing it for me. Okay, now let's move on to talking about the YA books that I read this month. The first one of those is the only non-fantasy YA I read, which is a YA historical retelling, and that is Selfmade Boys by Anne Marie McLemore. This is a Great Gatsby retelling where the main character of Nick is both Latinx and a trans man. And just like in The Great Gatsby, he goes to New York to see his cousin Daisy. However, as an added element to this story, Daisy is trying to erase her Latinx heritage and is passing as white, and has kind of written off Nick as just a friend of the family. Also, like the original story, Nick is enthralled by the lavish parties that his neighbor Gatsby is holding. And while he's at one of these parties, he learns that Gatsby is also a young trans man. This book I also gave 3 stars. I just wasn't very impressed with this. I don't think this book is bad, but I think it's maybe a combination of it being also a little boring, and I didn't really like the writing style. I don't know, I think part of it was I just don't know if this story can really work with teenagers, and I feel like throughout the entirety of reading this book, I was just kind of questioning how much I can read YA books anymore. Sometimes YA I feel like can really give me exactly what I want and need from a story. But I feel like the plot of The Great Gatsby, I just felt like it was really disjointed when the story is now being told about 17 and 18-year-olds. However, the best part, and I think also the thing that kept me from giving this a lower rating, is all of the trans elements, which is definitely what I went into the book expecting to like. I like the elements of the old-timey binders, kind of the language that's used around what it feels like to be trans, and to take solace in finding other trans and queer people. I feel like that was all very good and definitely what the book was aiming for, and I thought what was done the best. This was another book that was part of my 24 books to read in 2024 and definitely was a little bit of a letdown. Okay, and the last 3 books we were going to be talking about are all ones I read in my finishing series. I'm in the middle of a vlog that recently came out. The first one of those is Finale by Stephanie Garber. This is a YA fantasy series that primarily follows 2 sisters, Scarlett and Donatella, who in the first book run away to this kind of magical festival called Caraval. Since this is the 3rd book in the series, I can't talk about anything else without giving a lot of spoilers. But basically, each of the sisters has a romance with a different guy, and the younger sister, Donatella, is in a love triangle with 2 different guys. One of them is Jax from the Once Upon a Broken Heart series, and this series is a prequel series to that, so ideally you should read them and have all of Caraval done before you start Once Upon a Broken Heart. However, I did read it in reverse order, and I feel like overall, I just don't like the series quite as much as I do that trilogy. I gave this book 3.5 stars, which is the same rating I gave the first book in the series. And like I said, overall, I just don't like the 2 main characters, Scarlett or Donatella, nearly as much as I do Evangeline from Once Upon a Broken Heart, nor do I like the male romantic leads as much as I do Jax, and Jax is really the saving grace of this series. I enjoy these books mostly for him and the kind of more villainous role he's able to play here. However, there are just a lot of very strange plot choices and just rationales that the characters have that is so the opposite of what I expected them to do. There also definitely were some plot points in this book specifically where I felt like things were really just treading water when we kind of already had the answers from very early on in the book that even the characters knew. It wasn't even just something that we, the audience, knew that the characters hadn't figured out. They had figured it out. They just decided to kind of do the same thing over again to try and find an alternative way to get through the situation, which I thought was very stupid, and again, just kind of a way to pad the book's length, or just create drama for drama's sake. However, at the same time, I do really like Stephanie Garber's writing style. I like her purple prose and how descriptive and imaginative everything is. So for that reason, I was having a good time with this book for the most part. Okay, the next book we are going to talk about is Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. This is the sequel to Divine Rivals, which is a very light historical fantasy that follows our 2 main characters, Iris and Roman, who are living in this war-torn country and are able to communicate with each other kind of anonymously through these 2 magical typewriters. This book starts off on a massive cliffhanger that the previous book ended on, so I can't talk too much about the specifics of this book. However, I really did like this. I ended up giving it 4 stars, which is the same rating I gave Divine Rivals. However, I do think Divine Rivals is a little bit better of a book overall. I can understand why a lot of people maybe don't like this one as much, especially since it starts off with a very disliked trope that can kind of seem like we're doing everything from the previous book over again. However, I ended up actually liking it and felt like it was a good kind of reversal and new perspective that we saw from the previous book. And that element did kind of fade away by the 40% mark of the book anyway. So even if I did find it annoying, it definitely wouldn't have been something that would have hindered my experience of the book overall. I also think that this book did a good job in kind of expanding the world building and actually giving a lot of the magical elements that we definitely were promised in the previous book in the series. And even with the additional information of like the gods and the wartime elements, it definitely always connected back to the relationship of Iris and Roman, which is definitely the heart of the story. They definitely are apart from each other in more of this book than the previous one, but I feel like the romance and the love that they have for each other still comes through very strongly. So yes, I did enjoy this book, and I'm very glad I finally finished off this duology. Okay, the last book we are going to talk about is Wisteria by Adeline Grace. This book is the third and final book in the Belladonna trilogy. And the first book in the series, Belladonna, originally follows our main character, Signa, who is a girl that is unable to die, and she has a tumultuous relationship with the personified form of death. There's often kind of like a magical murder mystery element to all of these books, and this book actually shifts our main character to be Blythe, who we learned about more in the second book in the series, and is Signa's cousin. This book I ended up giving 2.5 stars, which is so incredibly sad because I really was hoping that I would love every book in this series. I feel like this book could have been a 3 stars with just the beginning half being very boring and the romance between Blythe and her love interest just like not really giving for me. I thought it got a little bit better later on, but then the ending was so bad. I feel like overall it just like did not have the charm that the first book in the series does. And a lot of that does, I think, come through with me just like not liking Blythe and her love interest nearly as much as I like the relationship of Signa and Death. They are just like everything to me and exactly what I want in a relationship. And even if they have some enemies to lovers elements when they first meet, I think that they get over that and their relationship develops in a really organic and understandable way. Whereas with this one, I just did not get or feel any of the chemistry that Blythe has with her love interest. And I think that they took way too much time in the like enemies phase of enemies to lovers instead of having like any sort of like natural bonding to get me to the point where I would understand like the sacrifices that the love interest makes in the end for the sake of Blythe and how much he claims to love her. So yes, I am very disappointed to be leaving off this series on such a sour note. I'll always still probably love Belladonna, and I definitely want to probably reread that book in the series, but I'm still not sure how I feel about Foxglove and Wisteria and what I'm going to do with my special edition copies of them. However, this book is very much hinting at the idea that there could be like a novella or like a spin-off series coming in the future. And I don't know, I might still check that out because I am still hoping that eventually we'll get to that same love that I had for the first book in the series. But I think I'm going to take a little bit of a pause and probably not pre-order that one when it eventually comes out. So those are all of the 8 books that I read in August. I'd love to know how your reading month went in the comments down below, or if you've read any of the books that I ended up reading, I'd love to hear what your thoughts on them are as well. If you guys enjoyed this video, consider liking, commenting, or subscribing if you aren't already. Consider following me on the Storygraph if you'd like to see my reading updates in real time, as well as following me on my Bookstagram, which is also linked in the description. And that is going to be it for me today. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!